Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion on trends in e-prescribing regulation and legislation. My name is Melissa Bundy, and I'm the Point of Care Partners Lead of Marketing and Regulatory Resource Center. Today's webinar is part of a series that we offer each quarter where we basically just summarize the latest and most pressing regulatory trends and activities we're seeing. And before I go over our agenda and introduce our speakers, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. So your GoToWebinar dashboard, you should be able to see that over to your right usually. Everybody will be muted during the webinar, but you are able to send questions through the question pane. You can see that, you should see it in your dashboard, and you can maximize it by clicking on the little arrow. We will answer all the questions during the Q&A session at the end. If you don't see that question pane, you may need to click on the orange arrow to maximize your GoToWebinar interface. Also regarding sound, if you're using your computer speaker system for audio and you need to join over the phone, you just go down to the audio section, maximize that, choose phone, and then you'll get the call-in information and can switch over your audio that way. When the webinar ends, we will have a brief survey that will appear on your screen, and we would love for your feedback. So please take that at the end. It's just a couple of questions. We also have a handful of interactive polls throughout the presentation, and we hope you'll participate in that as well. This session is being recorded, and we will be sending out a link to the recorded presentation afterwards. And for those of you that are just now joining us, welcome. So as I mentioned, this is going to be a panel discussion today, and here are just some of the topics that are going to be covered during that discussion. We have Derek Pike leading the discussion with both of our co-editors of the Regulatory Resource Center State Law Review and LTPAC State Navigator, and some of our other subscription intelligence solutions that we offer. We will go over the volume of some of the major federal and state legislation, their impact, and most of it is kind of specific to e-prescribing. We'll also touch on the long-term post-acute care setting, deadlines coming up, impact of noncompliance, and then what we're kind of looking for or expecting in 2020. So first, we're going to have our first poll here. So let me launch this. Basically, we're just interested in learning about how you're currently, how well you're currently staying on top of state regulations, and you should see a poll that pops up on your screen. And if you will just quickly choose, how you feel you're doing as far as monitoring and staying on top of the changes in state regulations around e-prescribing and EPA. All right. It looks like several of you have voted, so I'm going to close that now, and we'll see what we've got. All right, so it looks like most of you were, it's kind of a third and a third. We realize there's a lot going on, and it's hard to stay on top of stuff. So that's interesting. Yeah, it's probably pretty much about what we see. All right, so thank you for participating in that poll. And next, I am going to hand it over to Derek and our co-editors to introduce themselves, and we'll get the discussion started. Derek, you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Thanks, Melissa. Hello, everyone. And let me also say thank you for spending some of your day with us. We know that it takes some effort to do that, and we hope to make this worth your while, informative, and maybe a little bit entertaining at the same time. I'm Derek Pike. I am the Regulatory Resource Manager for POCP. My involvement probably comes with about 25 years of pharmaceutical background, but for about 5 years I was the Executive Vice President for the Florida Society of Health System Pharmacists, an association based in Tallahassee, and of course that's where the state capital is. And I was, well, I guess that you could say fortunate. I was fortunate enough to be involved in some of the legislative activities that were discussed and brought forth at the time, and it's kind of true what they say about you don't want to see sausage being made or maybe legislation being made either. But it did give me an insight and kind of I guess, a unique perspective on the regulations that we all have to deal with day to day, month to month. So that's my background. I'm going to introduce Michelle and then Keith Fisher. Michelle?
Hi, good morning. My name is Michelle Sobel. I'm a pharmacist and I am one of the co-editors of the Point of Care Partners Regulatory Resource Center. I've been following e-prescribing laws for several years and have seen many changes over the last several years. Keith, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Keith Fisher. I, too, am a pharmacist. I'm a senior consultant here at Point of Care Partners. I've been involved with POCP for about 4 years now. Prior to that relationship, I've been involved with many different topics relevant to our topic at hand today, related to Medicare Part D, prescribing, database compendia information, et cetera. So as such, it sets us up to kind of talk about some of our editing responsibilities and the topics that we're seeing today as part of our Regulatory Resource Center.
Very good. Thanks, Keith. Okay, so before we jump into the discussion, and again, this is going to be kind of like a panel discussion, we're going to talk about these different topics. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is just do a bit of level setting as to all the entities that govern this prescribing process. Now, if you see the slide, you obviously see all the different state boards of medicine, pharmacy, nursing. All these agencies have oversight and some responsibility on how prescriptions are written and how they're electronically delivered. The primary overseer of this is typically the State Board of Pharmacy. However, we hear back from a lot of our clients that there's a collaboration of boards of medicine, nursing, and other specific agencies, I guess, for lack of a better word, that have come forward on the opioid and other controlled substance prescriptions regulations. So if you look at all these items, this is what you are dealing with pretty much with keeping yourself in compliance and keeping your customers in compliance as well. And it's a lot. That's a lot on anyone's plate or any team's plate. Now, the DEA regulates all controlled substances at the federal level. Some states do have their own controlled substance agencies, Bureau of Narcotics or other controlled substance management. And all that does is add another layer of complexity. So you have agencies mandating their own controlled substance schedules. Sometimes these coincide with the federal level, and you know what? But many times they don't. So let me just mention to you that the service that we offer, that our regulatory service that Keith and Michelle are quite involved with, and they monitor this from a day-to-day perspective, and we'll be talking more about that. But these, we're involved with, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there, Board of Pharmacy newsletters, board meeting minutes, letters to licensees and other agencies for changes or any kind of clarifications they may publish. So it's quite an in-depth effort that we do to keep our clients in compliance as well. So these results, these regulations are difficult to find. They're hard to sift through. Sometimes they're even tough to understand. And we know how challenging that is for providers because it's just too many variables. And many times providers will try to interpret these rules themselves, or they'll turn to colleagues for advice. Typically, that leads to misinterpretation for good or bad, and providers end up leaning heavily on their EHRs to keep them compliant. And I know I'm just verbalizing what you guys already know. So the last thing on the right side of that slide we talk about is you do not want dissatisfied customers. You do not want customers to tell you when they're out of compliance. That's a lost opportunity for you. And then your staff has to spend additional time and effort where they should be doing other projects, filling in with the hot fix or trying to make up for a compliance gap that they missed. So what we did was we put together just some type of estimated cost of what does it cost for someone to miss a regulatory change? And we try to be very conservative about this. And we basically boiled it down to three things: help desk calls, hot fixes, and some intangible cost. Now, a help desk call, you figure one call a month from each customer. That's about 1%. They're related to missed regulatory issues, and that might equal something to the effect of about 3 hours of staff time. Hot fixes, much more expensive, of course. Each hot fix has to address some missed regulatory change, and we think conservatively that takes about 5 hours per customer. And that involves a number of your different departments: your product management team, development team, Q&A, distribution, installation, and that could be even more. But again, we look at that as a conservative number. We just pulled $50,000. It seemed that it was a fair number for us. And the intangible costs, we can't quantify those. We're unable to do that because you don't know what's going to happen as far as customer satisfaction. And we've had too many stories where a client called the product team and let them know of a compliance issue that they were having because their EHR was out of compliance, and none of us like to see that happening. So I'm sure that your organization tracks these type of activities. And to go into our next poll, we're going to learn about how often your organization has had to deal with these hot fixes. So the question is, in the last 2 years, has your company had to roll out a patch or a hot fix in order to comply with an enacted regulation or rule? And Melissa, do you want to tally that?
Got a couple more people responding here. All right. So everybody that responded said that they had to roll out a hot fix in the last 2 years.
How about that? Very interesting. That's good feedback. Thank you all for participating in that poll. Okay, moving on. Keith and Michelle, our co-editors, learn more about the scope of regulatory and legislative activities in 2019. And I'm going to ask both you guys, looking at 2019, how busy was 2019, and what do you see the future holding in 2020?
Well, thanks, Derek.
Michelle,
I think I'll go first. To date, we've conservatively estimated there are approximately 500 laws, regulations, and rules in place across the country in which you need to comply. And not to mention, there's the details of each of these 500. There's probably close to 100 regulations and rules just on who can prescribe, what they can prescribe, and how much. And add in the rise of mid-level providers, podiatrists, dentists, and such, it becomes a challenge to manage if you have a variety of different prescribers using your system. Keith, tell me about what's been happening in 2019.
So let's do a little level set with this 500 number and what's going on and what has happened in 2019 that influences these 500 laws. Just this year to date, we've been monitoring over 390 pieces of legislation alone at the state and federal level. Those have been introduced yet this particular year. So these all contribute to, they introduce, or they completely modify, they might introduce completely new laws, or they might modify some of the existing laws and regulations. So that's kind of the activity that kind of, again, influences the 500 that's represented on this particular slide. Now, not all those bills get enacted. So far this particular year, we've had about a little over 100 of those 390 bills actually get enacted. We also had about 125 of those that have failed due to a legislative session adjournment. Sometimes these bills get merged with other bills, and other times they just flat out get defeated by the legislature. So that leaves about 160 odd bills that actually are still in the legislative process and working their way through yet this year. Some of these might carry over into 2020. when sometimes these legislatures adjourn for the year, depending upon the state law, these bills then will get picked up again next year. Other times they got to be refiled if in fact they want to be reintroduced. So we evaluate and monitor all of this activity on your behalf, thereby freeing up your time for other business opportunities. Now, the other thing to kind of keep in mind, I just been talking about the volume here for legislative activities, not any regulatory activity. And there are oftentimes a lot of regulatory activity that accompany each one of these legislative bills.
I'm sorry, Keith, I'm having a technical problem here. Give me 1 second. Okay, so in listening to that, Keith, it almost sounds like all of these legislative pieces are solely focused on e-prescribing and controlled substances. Is that true, Michelle?
No, it's not solely focused on e-prescribing. I mean, you still have to manage the printed prescription. We all thought that was a thing of the past, but because of technical issues sometimes, or there are exemptions, you still need to make sure you have the functionality available to your prescribers to be able to print a prescription. You have to make sure that these printed prescriptions are in their state-specific format. Recently, I can tell you that Ohio changed their requirements for printed prescriptions to accommodate their ICD-10 requirement. Prescription requirements and rules for electronic transmission are still changing as legislators and regulatory agencies learn from their current implementations as well as other states, and as a result, they need to tweak their rules. We believe we'll continue to see changes even in states where laws and rules are already in place. Regulations around mandatory transmission regulations requiring controlled substances via EPCS, and in some cases even for all prescriptions.
Okay. So Keith, I have 2 questions for you. Are we ever going to have a webinar where Ohio is not mentioned? Is the first one. The second one is, what areas do you see the most activity occurring?
Well, perhaps the first question, the answer is the easiest. No, we're always going to have Ohio. Ohio truly is a leading state. You know, they certainly have a lot of activity that goes on constantly. So, in all seriousness, there. But most legislation from which our particular team here at Point of Care Partners sees does in fact relate to EPCS, electronic prescribing of controlled substances, as well as EPA, or electronic prior authorizations. Both of these really addressing the opioid crisis, which is clearly the driver of most of the legislation that's going on right now. As we see in this particular slide, most of the state legislative sessions are over, but even in states that have not passed laws in these particular subjects, like in EPCS and EPA, Medicare Part D prescriptions are or will be affected regardless of the state statutes. So we got 37 state legislatures that are actually done for this year. We know that North Carolina is going to be ending soon. And that leaves us with 12 states plus the District of Columbia that actually come up with, I kind of dub as our lucky 13. Plus we've also got 3 additional territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and Virgin Islands that are still needing to weigh in on what's going on here. Now, EPCS, good news perhaps, we've got 28 states enacted. Now there's lots of different details and implementation dates that differ within all these various different states, but most of these will become effective no later than 1/1 of 2021, which coincides with the Medicare Part D regulations. Similarly, on the electronic prior authorization front here, 14 states have legislation that's enacted that that specifically require electronic prior authorizations. So if that's the good news, well, what's the bad news? Well, I think the bad news for both of these situations is you can clearly see most of these states still don't have laws that are in effect that's going to address these two major subjects by 1/1/21. And that's when, again, the federal Part D rules kind of kick into effect. Otherwise, you're going to see, conflicting information here, conflicting regulations. You got to do something for Medicare Part D and potentially nothing at all for all the other patients. But even within the Part D realm, what does the state say regarding the guide rails that support that? So we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a future slide or two.
Yeah. And 1/1/21 it's actually just right around the corner, isn't it, Keith?
a short 1 year and 6 weeks. So keep that in mind too.
It's going to be here before we know it. So you mentioned that the opioid crisis is the driver to a lot of this legislation. So let me ask both of you: are the states following each other's examples in this, or are they like depending on the trickle down from the federal activity? And Michelle, why don't you take that first?
Well, yeah, Derek, yes. The federal legislation typically is the primary driver for state activity. Keep in mind, these federal laws and regulations, even though they're really Medicare oriented, really are significant drivers for all prescribing activities. And they do impact private commercial insurance and other government entities like Medicaid and health insurance exchanges. We know that the script standard needs to be implemented for Medicare Part D patients by 1/1/20. We've received, recent comments from our customers asking us to help reconcile these requirements around the script 2017-0701 and its implementation date of 1/1/20 versus the HR6 implementation of EPCS and EPA by 1/1/21. We know that every time a new standard is mandated, there are challenges in making the changes, getting certified, and then updating all the prescriber applications in time.
I think just calling that a challenge is probably an understatement, right?
Right.
So, Keith, now that kind of leads us into a direction that I want you to get involved in more about, like the CMS rules. And how do you see how they impact activity at the state level?
Sure. So I've actually been involved in Medicare Part D since its inception in 2006. And again, Part D, I can't state this enough. It definitely is the driver for commercial laws and regulations. Of important note here, as we've kind of depicted on this particular slide, is that on April 16th of last year, CMS published their final rule, 4182F, that actually adopts the new NCPDP script standard version 2017-071 that Michelle referenced. And it also retires the current NCPDP script version 10.6. Now, this is for within the Medicare Part D prescription drug benefit program. All of this effective in 6 weeks from today, January 1 of 2020. Then in May of this year, CMS published another final rule, 4180-F, that requires the Medicare Part D plans to adopt one or more of the real-time benefit tools that are capable of giving prescribers some clinically appropriate, patient-specific, real-time formulary and benefit information. What's this product, if I prescribe it, going to cost this patient? And that mandate will become effective a year from now, January 1 of 2021. We know both of these things are significantly driving activity on the e-prescribing front. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen here, we think it's also prudent for us to call attention to the promoting interoperability guidance. New terminology here is PI instead of using meaningful use, which we've all pretty much been familiar with to date. And then this particular requirement is that there's an overlap between the script requirement there and what Part D is requiring, and Michelle mentioned this as well. So if a prescriber never prescribes for a Medicare Part D patient, well, then maybe the script 10.6 will be just fine. That's the minimum of the PI requirement. But if a Part D patient is seen by one of those prescribers and they need a prescription, then they have to comply with the 2017-071 version. So once a particular vendor implements and a prescriber actually adopts and utilizes the 2017-071 version, is there really any need to revert back to the older 10.6 version?
Huh. Yeah, that's an interesting question there, Keith. You know, that'd be interesting if we can get some feedback from some of our attendees right now. That's an interesting. It's almost like a conundrum type of thing there. But so hopefully, I'll just plant that seed that if anybody has some insight on what do you think about, you know, prescribers having to revert back to the older 10.6 version, write yourself a note and maybe give us some feedback on that. And moving forward, Keith, do you have a summary of how many states currently have legislation pending or has passed laws in some of these key areas?
Sure. So this particular slide here depicts several key areas that we have been monitoring that we believe influences all of this. If we take a look at the top left box here, we see 28 states with some form of e-prescribing legislation that's already been enacted. Doesn't mean they're in effect yet, but they have been enacted. Of these particular 28, 6 of those states actually are effective right now. Including New Jersey. New Jersey is kind of a little different with the rest of the states related to this subject in that it requires just that the EHR vendors have to be able to support EPCS for C2 drugs. There is no mandate yet that requires the prescribers to actually use it. I will tell you that there is legislation currently pending in New Jersey that will in fact require prescribers to start to use EPCS at some point in the future. The other 22 states that have enacted laws, those are going to go into effect at various different times that are out there. If we take a look at the middle top section there, I caution folks when they look at these particular numbers here. The current and pending laws that are on the books right now stipulate either allowed electronic prior authorization or requires prior authorization electronically. Only 14 of them fall in that latter category where they require electronic prior authorization. And in both of these particular categories, we see specific mention of NCPDP's transaction. That is the script transaction. We see that mentioned 15 different times. So it's safe to say that the majority of the activity around electronic prior authorization is around the presumption that standardizing or creating a single prior authorization form to be submitted via a portal will solve the prescriber's concerns. Now, that is in direct conflict with the Support Act because that basically says, again, by Part D, portals are not possible. Portals will not satisfy this requirement for the Medicare Part D arena, and that all goes into effect by 1/1/21. So specifically in the states that are not yet prepared to supplement and confirm the Support Act within their states, prescribers may use electronic prior authorization. They got to use that within the Part D world, but what's going to happen with all the other patients that are out there? So particularly in the realm of electronic prior authorization, it seems like we've got lots of legislative work that's still needed in 2020. Otherwise, this mandate for 2021 is going to come and go, and people are not going to be prepared for that. Real quickly, let's work our way over to the left-hand side. The right-hand side of this particular box. We see PDMP, a prescription drug monitoring program that prescribers in actually 45 states are mandated to do some sort of query of the database prior to prescribing. But that still leaves 9 states and territories who've got no query that's mandated. And in the bottom section of this particular slide, we note some statistics related to controlled substance limitation laws and regulations. These are in addition to all the federal DEA limitations and these are all gaining a lot more focus as the states themselves are trying to rein in their concerns and issues with the opioid crisis. Almost always these include additional restrictions on the definition of what's a controlled substance in that state and that state's treatment of it within a particular schedule. Sometimes they have things in Schedule 3 instead of Schedule 5, or not even, or they might schedule something completely themselves and it's not scheduled at the federal level. And of course, we see differences in day supply limitations, who can prescribe things when we talk about mid-level prescribers. And we even see, as we alluded to in Ohio, diagnoses on some of the controlled substance prescriptions.
Hey, Keith. We did have a question come up while you were talking through that. Figured I'd go ahead and ask it now while it's relevant to what you're talking about. So there was a question around, is there any chance that the EPA 1.1, January 1st, 21 date for HR 6 gets pushed out or delayed?
Well, that's a good question. There's always that chance, but we got to keep in mind that is a date that is mandated by literally an act of Congress. So it is possible that the federal government, the legislatures could come back and push that out. If that doesn't happen, then history has shown us that CMS and other agencies are obligated to write the rules and regulations around that date. It'll be interesting to see how that might materialize.
Okay. So Keith, moving on about the prescription drug monitoring programs, and could you tell us a little bit more about what their impact is on the opioid crisis? As a matter of fact, Michelle, your turn to talk. Are all these PDMPs standalone, or are they somehow connected?
Well, you know, Derek, PDMPs we know are making a difference in the opioid crisis. Every state has one except, we all know Missouri's the holdout. And many states have adopted rules to either encourage or mandate prescribers to check the PDMP before prescribing opioids or maybe other controlled substances. Likewise, we are also seeing requirements where the dispensing pharmacist now is required to check the PDMP prior to dispensing opioids, benzodiazepines, and maybe even all controlled substances. They get a little, what I call, maybe not so much required. They're required to use the PDMP when they think maybe abuse is suspected, the patient's new to their pharmacy, or, maybe any of those other red flags that come up. There was a recent study published in Health Affairs that reported significant reductions in opioid deaths in states with PDMPs, and that was really to help identify doctor shopping patients and pill mill prescribers. And it also assists, law enforcement and state boards to catch patients, prescribers, and pharmacists with controlled substance anomalies. From a practical perspective, one can imagine the workflow challenges that exist as more and more prescriptions require PDMP queries. So there is a huge push to integrate the queries into the prescribing and dispensing software instead of toggling out of the normal workflow and logging into a separate URL to access and query the databases. There are many states that are encouraging integration, and some are even offering grants in order to help with that integration process. So we're going to go to some key timelines right now in a little bit more detail. So Keith, maybe you can walk us through this timeline.
Certainly. So this particular slide illustrates the number of states that have implementation around EPCS from up and through 1/1 of 2022. So we know that 21 states have laws that already are passed, but many of these are not yet in effect. As we stated earlier, New Jersey is certainly the interesting one. As of May 1st of this year, again, the state started requiring that the EHRs had to support the EPCS, but there's no business need for the pharmacists or for the prescribers to actually use that. We have one Northeast state that mandated EPCS requirement that became effective in October of this year. And then at the beginning of next year, 6 individual states kick in. Actually, 5 individual states kick in. That relates to controlled substances that have to be electronically prescribed. And I will point out here that Iowa and Florida actually requires that for all prescriptions, not just controlled substance prescriptions. Additionally, Florida is a little more unique in that their 1/1/2020 deadline there, that's really the beginning of their mandate for transition over to ePrescribing. The prescribers have to start to comply with that at the time that their controlled substance license renews. So it's a continuum there that begins in January of this coming year and doesn't end for 18 months. But by the end of that 18-month period, everybody in Florida has to be prescribing electronically. And then in July of next year, Virginia's EPCS laws become effective. We note that in January of 2021, as we've talked about, H.R. 6 or the Support Act mandates EPCS for the Part D world. And then in July of next year, we got 2 other states becoming effective. And lastly, those that are on the books at this particular point, California has delayed their implementation to January of 2022, again, but for non-Part D business. So again, if you do the math on here, there certainly are a lot of states that are missing from this because they don't have that activity just quite yet. So if we take a look at that same level of requirements that are already been enacted, when we look at it here, a little different view as of October of this particular year. Recall, we've again stated that there's the federal government and 28 states with enacted bills. So this slide illustrates the variability by the type of drug that has to be prescribed based upon these enacted laws. Okay, so even though again in red are Iowa and Florida, those are coming up right around the corner. So we just want to make sure people clearly are seeing that that's going to be a requirement 6 weeks. Right now, we only have 3 states in the dark gray on this particular map, and those are states that currently have proposed legislation on the books right now. And so far for 2020 legislative sessions, besides a couple of bills that have carried over from 2019 due to legislative closures, we don't see any activity going on yet in 22 with new bills. So as a reminder, this map doesn't say when these laws become effective, just that these states have enacted laws that mandate the EPCS. So I think the message here is that we can expect to see much more activity around electronic prescribing mandates, whether that be in the dark gray and the light gray states and territories, which is 26 of them. Let me restate that. 26 states and territories still don't have legislation in place. And so we might definitely see some activity there. We also see that there could be certainly some adjustments to those that are going from green to red, from just controlled substances to all prescriptions, or vice versa, from red back down to green. We actually saw that in one particular state just recently here. Or another EPCS tweaks that we might see based upon, again, prescriber or patient feedback, as well as experiences that are encountered there within that particular state or some of the adjoining states to that state. So the key here is understanding the nuances. We have to be able to communicate that to your customers, and we need to get all your customers on board with that.
So Keith, tell me this, let me lob you this softball. What happens if a state goes from green to red?
Well, that's an excellent question, and then this would be Point of Care Partners' response to that. We will publish what we call sentinel alerts to our customer base. Whenever we see that there's something that's out there that is a significant change in the legislation or regulation, or perhaps something that's happening very, very quickly, then we're gonna publish something out and let our clients know about that. Here, we called specific attention to a Massachusetts regulation that was adopted just recently. Officially, it's still pending legislative oversight. In Massachusetts, they have the opportunity legislatively to basically nix some of the rules that kind of went into place and kind of revisit those. They've got till the end of the year to do that. But in this particular case, we certainly see that there can be times in which a bill needs to have some tweaks to it because there are technical or operational challenges for that. In this particular case, what happened here was that in Massachusetts, the bill got introduced that says, hey, all controlled substances need to be e-prescribed. And by definition, that included what they consider C6 drugs that are all legend drugs that are not controlled by the DEA. So essentially, it made all prescriptions electronically prescribed. So that will be relaxed a little bit so that it's only Cs 2 through 5, as well as a delay in the implementation date for a year.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Michelle, what's your take on this this e-prescribing using the PA forms, EPA?
Well, Derek, many states have enacted standardized PA forms, thinking this, will make the process for prior authorizations more efficient and less painful. That really seems to be the main activity right now, which is a little bit disappointing. If you've seen the press lately, though, prescribers really are complaining about the entire PA process, be it for drugs or procedures. So maybe, in the next couple of years, we're going to see some activity of encouraging electronic prior authorization processes. I mean, personally, I think EPA will lag in adoption, just like EPCS has taken about 9 to 10 years to really get some traction. Unfortunately, EPA adoption doesn't happen organically, as it usually takes federal and state mandates to create incentive to adopt new technology and standards.
I agree. I agree.
So, one item
I didn't interrupt you.
It's okay. It's just one item I wanted to kind of let you know we also track is specific DEA schedule variances. And you might ask, really, why do I care about this? Well, it's important that in states where you have providers that you make changes to the drug compendia to comply with the state rules. Keep in mind, the compendia is usually reported at the federal DEA levels only. So for example, we have 8 states now that have designated gabapentin as a Schedule 5 drug, while the DEA does not have it as a controlled substance. And we also see 9 states that require gabapentin and butalbital products to be reported to the PDMP. Your customers may ask you why they're seeing these particular drugs in their PDMP reports, as they're really not scheduled substances, but at least you need to be aware that these are being reported to the PDMP. We have found, though, monitoring state schedule variances to be very challenging, and there are exemptions at the federal level that may really make this really more complicated. What we do is we represent whether the state honors or does not honor the federal exemptions. But keep in mind, the federal DEA list is really NDC specific. And because of that, we tend to report at the more restrictive schedule. So we provide information when a drug moves from a non-controlled to a controlled substance status. And this is important as it determines how the drug is sent to the pharmacy and also helps really minimize callbacks from the pharmacy to your providers. Our recommendation really is to apply the stricter of the state or federal law. We always say your prescribers will thank you when they don't need to create a new prescription because you've coded this correctly. So Derek, let's, I think we have another poll.
Yes, we do. And we're coming into the home stretch here. And we're going to talk about the long-term post-acute care and some impacts on that. And we have a poll here. And I will call on Melissa to read the question and collect our answers.
Unfortunately, Derek, on this one, I accidentally clicked it twice, and I'm not able to launch it any further. But if you guys can put your answers into the question box, whether or not exemptions in LTPAC environments would impact you if they were rescinded, I would appreciate it very much.
Okay, very good. So interesting question. You know, would or how would your organization be affected if existing exemptions for non-hospital care settings, such as LTPAC care environments, if these were rescinded? That's we felt like that was a good question, and we're interested in hearing what the feedback would be on that. Thank you, Melissa. And Keith, back up to you, and let's talk a little bit more about the impact on the LTPAC environment.
Well, certainly, we understand that almost every prescriber that's out there from time to time has one of their particular patients that gets admitted to an LTPAC environment. And as such, there can't be certain rules and regulations that will require them on how they can interact with that patient while they're in that particular environment. Likewise, or as a result of that, we also know that there are technical and practical limitations that exist in the LTPAC environment for all of the things that we've talked about in the past hour here. State legislatures and the regulatory agencies certainly acknowledge that these exemptions and exceptions exist for these particular requirements within the LTPAC world. We actually have got a separate LTPAC state navigator service that we provide here. It's kind of an add-on service to our standard law review. In that particular environment or service here, we're going to call out the specific LTPAC exemptions and exceptions that we just reviewed. Practitioners in that LTPAC environment, you know, they've got to attend to a unique set of twists in this particular market, and they've got to understand that their compliance requirements, you know, with the PDMP, with the EPCS, with the controlled substance limitations, and all the other areas. So we know that they all want to have those things addressed within their existing software environment. So here we've certainly listed the main areas that we specifically address in many states. And we include that in our LTPAC State Navigator today. Finally, as with other areas covered today, Point of Care Partners actively monitors and participates in various standards development work groups like the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs, several of these that actually define the technical capabilities that permits the prescribers, pharmacists, and the payers to all talk the same language, addressing these business and regulatory needs, not only of the LTPAC vendors and practitioners, but all of the various areas that we've talked about today. Here's the thought that I think I'd like to pose up to folks to ponder here, and specifically here within LTPAC, but it's certainly, I think you can also apply this to other areas as well. If there are exemptions at the state level based upon the capability or some of the LTPAC technical limitations of the NCPDP script 10.6, do all these go away with the implementation of script 2017-071? Clearly the standard supports almost all of these particular limitations that were written into the laws. So do they go away now? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's a very good question that we all got to think about, and we all got to kind of keep our eye on to see what are those reactions going to be at the state level. Michelle, what else do we think is on the horizon here?
Okay, well, I don't have a crystal ball, but here's what, both of us have been thinking will happen in 2020 and beyond. EPCS and EPA will be required in 2021, so we expect to see a lot of activity, hopefully, at the state levels. We're PDMP integration and connectivity between the states and with the AHRs will be a huge focus. Electronic prior auth for both prescription drugs and procedures hopefully will gain more traction. Providers are certainly pushing for electronic options as more and more drugs are specialty and require prior authorization. And then, as Keith said, exemptions in the LTPAC environment, we think will be eventually lifted as the new standard gets implemented in 2020. So Derek, as we wrap up, what is one of the most important messages you would leave our audience today?
Well, before we leave this slide, I would like to just have our audience just scroll over these points one more time. You and Keith are incredibly smart, and I know that neither one of you have a crystal ball, but I would bet on you guys as far as what you would see happening in the future. But I would be also curious about the backgrounds of our current attendees. As you look at this, what's your thoughts on what's going to happen in 2020 and beyond? So I just want to leave that up for another second or two and let you scroll over the different titles there before we move on. But as we go on to the next part, so just briefly put on a quick sales hat that we offer a service that provides all of our clients regular updates and consulting hours on a quarterly basis. And we design it around a subscription model. And we kind of feel like we're in the foxhole with you. And it's our job to keep you guys absolutely up to the latest, greatest compliance so that you don't have a situation that comes up and bites you. And we have a team of experts like you've heard, Keith and Michelle and others that are not on the call that really help us provide what we think is the best service that is possible for this. It's we also include the LTPAC Navigator, like Keith referred to. It's an add-on to our law review, and it specifically goes into a lot of the issues around the long-term care conundrum. And in addition to the citations, those are provided as well. And so additionally, I want to let you know that we have an industry report, and that's what's on the slide right here. And we actually completed this very comprehensive report on electronic prior authorizations. And that's available for purchase, and there's a discount code there if you want to see it, Reg 25. I want to thank everyone at this point for attending, taking your lunch hour today to be a part of our program. We feel like, again, it's informative, and we try to make it not just informative, but somewhat of a different type of informational exchange as well. And if anybody has any kind of feedback, particularly positive, we would be glad to take that. Of course, I'm joking. We'll take any kind of feedback because we want to do these, and we want to make them very informational, and we want to make them something that you guys can take and utilize in your world as well. So, Melissa, I'll turn it over to you to wrap up.
Thanks, Derek. And we actually do have one question. Do you have any idea what percentage of vendors are already supporting EPA, or what percent will be supporting them throughout 2020? And I
So
think the answer,
That's,
go ahead.
wow.
I don't have those numbers at my fingertips. From an EPA perspective, it is not where we would like to see it, of course, being that we're a short 12, 13 months away from that particular EPA deadline. We do know that there's a couple states that have already got some things happening on the books right now. That there has to be some level of compliance with the EP electronic prior authorization requirements now. But it's as that slide dictated, it's a very small number at this particular point that's mandated, and as a result, there's not too many people have yet implemented things. They're just waiting for the regulations to kind of kick in to see if they got to do something special as well. Michelle, any thoughts that you've seen out there?
No, I haven't seen any specific statistics. It's still lagging pretty, I think not where we would like it to be, but, electronic solutions always tend to be, challenging. Sometimes there's an added expense for the providers, and sometimes they have to decide whether or not to, take that new functionality. But no, I don't have those statistics myself. So.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Seems like there's, I was going to say, it seems like there's just a lot of variables at this point right now at this stage of it.
Yeah. I think it's clear, though, that for the drug products that have to be electronically prescribed, and given the fact that Medicare D is saying that Medicare D Part D drugs in patients that are Part D patients that require prior authorization, they're going to have to comply with this. We also know that even though you've implemented script for ePrescribing, there's still a considerable amount of work that needs to be done to implement the prior authorization component of that. So I think that that's got to be on people's roadmaps pretty quickly so that they can start to prepare and then tweak it perhaps with any of the state rules and regulations that come down the road.
Great, thanks, guys. Are there any other questions? All right, I think, and we are almost to the top of the hour anyway. I appreciate it very much, everybody who tuned in today. And again, we will be sending out the recording of this session after the call. I hope everyone has a great day, and thank you again for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey. Yeah, go ahead and do that. Yeah, and that just gives you the file. It'll tell you where it saved it, but we also have the link. It'll be hosted on the GoToWebinar, and that's fine. Well, you can do other things while it's doing that, so it's fine. That's cool. Hey, Derek, I actually have to hop off on another call, which is why I was asking, like, can you, and I'm still trying to get this sent, and so are you able to end it? Like, it's still connected. No, if you might have already closed out. Actually, it's okay. Then I'll figure it out. It'll just either unfreeze or whatever. I'll figure it out. Okay, that's cool. That's cool. I'll figure it out. All right. Bye. Thanks. You do a great job, by the way.